Well, thank you all very, very much, and particularly Prince Michael. You know, I've often been jealous of Prince Michael. He's tall, he's very smart, he's very principled, he has 2 eyes, and he also has his own country. If I recall, Michael, and you can correct me on this, one time I said, well, how did you get your own country? And he says, we bought it. And I thought, well, that's a great capitalistic response. I particularly want to thank Barbara and Britt and all of you involved with the Hayek Institute for the fantastic work you've done. I have been to Vienna many, many times and thoroughly enjoyed this city. I also want to thank all of you who've shown up this evening, and particularly those who've come from other cities around Europe. It really makes you feel good when old friends show up at something like this. Michael had mentioned that actually I knew Hayek. I'm probably one of the last recipients of your award who can actually say, in honesty, that I knew Hayek. We actually have a picture here. I think that was taken in about 1986. I knew him the last 10 years of his life. I was a member of the Mont Pelerin Society, is how I got to know him back. I think I first met him in 1992. In 1994, we had a Mont Pelerin meeting in Cambridge, England. And as you can see, I was younger back then. And so several of us who were young guys, I think there was only guys at the point, I don't want to sound sexist here, but we were following the great master as he's walking around the little canals that you have in Cambridge, those of you who are familiar with the university. And it was a beautiful sunny day, and we're walking along, and he's describing the great battles he had with canes, because during World War II, they were both fire marshals and had been on the rooftops there of Cambridge University, arguing as they're holding their fire buckets or whatever they did at that time. And at one point after he's describing this, and you could tell great relish as he's describing these arguments with canes, he swings around and points directly at me. And he says, young man, remember part of the key to success is outliving your enemies. I thought that was good advice. And I've been trying to follow it. And in Washington, Ed Crane and Dan Mitchell and I have a little society called We're Against Death and Taxes. And we're hoping they'll quickly unlock the key to the aging process here. We've been fighting both these battles, and so far the opposition seems to be winning. With Hayek, he had a number of influences on my life. And you know, I was thinking back when Barbara had told me I would be getting the award, which things really stood out of things that really struck me that Hayek had talked about or we had had discussions on. And one was his whole concept of the limits of knowledge. I live near Washington. Washington, you have endless numbers of people spouting with great certainty about things they need to know nothing about or they could not know anything about. Actually, with the global warming crowd, I'm somewhat amused by some of the things that I read as if they say it with such fervor and great certainty about things that we can't measure and we don't know. We can go on and on through various types of public policy. And that basic concept has struck with me. One point I was chief economist of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And one of my aspects of the job that I hated was doing economic forecasts. And because I was a Hayekian, I really knew how hollow that always was. And the goal there was to beat the other forecasters, but I was never under the illusion that we could actually know. Another thing that stemmed out of this idea of the limits of knowledge, and particularly about what governments could or could not do, was the concept of the optimum size of government. And back in the 1980s, I actually did it originally for a report to the U.S. Chamber Board of Directors. I was looking at various countries around the world and how rapidly they were growing and the size of their governments. And I sketched out a little curve, just sort of freehand. And later on, we started doing more studies of this, of at what point you can have too little government or you can have too much government. The real problem, the major curse of mankind now is way too much government. Anyway, we've done a number of studies over the years, and one thing as an economist, you always want something you get known for, and in recent economic textbooks, some of them have now what they call the Rahn curve, which was first labeled by Business Week, about this relationship between the size of the government and economic growth and opportunity. Finally, another major impact Hayek had me was a book he wrote in 1976 called Denationalization of Currency. And it was his argument of why governments ought not to have a monopoly on currency or money or issue it at all. At that point, I had been representing the New York Mercantile Exchange, a major commodity exchange in the U.S., and part of my job as a young economist there was to try to come up with new futures contracts. And I read Hayek's book, and I thought, this is wonderful. So I came in and explained to the board of the Merc that we ought to do a commodity basket and laid out Hayek's arguments. And of course, they all looked at me like I was crazy and thought that was totally ridiculous at the time. Fortunately, the people at the Chicago Merc, one of our competitor organizations, started to move ahead with that. Anyway, I was fascinated by this whole idea of private money really since virtually all my adult professional life. And in 98, I wrote a book called The End of Money and the Struggle for Financial Privacy. And I could see how we could have digital money. And by that time, I thought, well, things would go into smart cards. You remember the idea of the smart card. Anyway, I wrote a whole book on this. And I could see things coming, but the blockchain and things like that had not been invented. So we always had the double spending problem with digital money. And then fortunately, with the people with Bitcoin, their real contribution wasn't the money, it was the idea of the blockchain. And actually, I've carried forth these ideas and written a lot about them, but also I'm a practical person. I've created some companies, and I thought, well, I'll never convince anybody just through my writings. So we put together a new little company, which we have based in Miami, Florida, to do an aluminum-backed currency. I know most of you think aluminum-backed currency, Richard Rahn, is nuts. It makes no sense at all. Well, I don't have time tonight to explain how it works, but if anybody wants to give me a card, I'll send you articles on it and why 10 years from now, your money is going to be aluminum-backed, it's going to be private, and government currencies will be going out the window. Thank you all. I appreciate so much you coming tonight and giving me this award. And I was very lucky because as a young man, I had got to know not only Hayek, but Milton Friedman and Jim Buchanan, who were both Nobel Prize winners and sponsors of me for the Mount Pelerin Society. And I know they must have been wondering whether you had that great generation of economists, if there were people who were going to carry forth their legacy. And so my generation of economists, I'm sure many of us think about that in the fight for freedom. And I've been very lucky over the last 24 hours to meet Gloria, your next recipient. And she is one who gives us great faith that that new generation also is going to carry on the fight for freedom. These battles are never fully won, and they're never fully lost. It's the continuing struggle for the mind of man and for liberty. And again, thank you all so much.